has long set as you walk down a dark alleyway. Through a yellowed window in an old storefront, a strange man beckons. You enter the room. Behind a desk he sits and reads to you. He reads strange tales, public domain literature. This is Small Frights and Other Delights.
Yes. Yes, welcome back to episode 3 of Small Frights and Other Delights. And boy, oh boy, do we have a program for you today. It is April 2nd, 2026. We just had a thunderstorm roll through Madison, Wisconsin. But I'm okay. It rained all day. Rained inches, maybe. Water on the roads. Splash in your window shield. Your windshield. The window that you have to shield your face on your car. The window shield. But we made it through. The rain is calming down, I believe. Or maybe not. But we're inside, so it's okay. Yeah, we have a real humdinger of a show for you today. I decided I'm going to read a short story that I wrote. Because I read a really long one that somebody else wrote. And I've already tried to record this show, I think, 3 times. And every time I just got mad at like my sentence structure. Or, you really learn a lot about how you write when you read it out loud. And what I learned wasn't necessarily great. But here's what I say. You should do creative things publicly. Show them to other people. Or just put them out there. Because it will help you improve. And you will not, I will not be as afraid to show things to people, and I will be motivated to keep doing those aforementioned things. So this is kind of an exercise for myself. This is a short story called The Boneyard, and it takes place in a mythical place called Northeast Texas, rather. And a lot of people, when they think of Texas, well, I guess they think of a lot of things. But if you're from the Midwest and you think of Texas, you think of cowboys, you think of wide open spaces, you think of big trucks, maybe. You think of the 72-ounce Big Tex steak eating challenge, where if you finish 72 ounces of ribeye in under an hour, you get it for free. And if you don't, I think you have to pay for it. And I don't know, that must be expensive. That's in Amarillo, Texas, which is the quintessential Texas area of wide open spaces, the Panhandle, the Llano Estacado, the Staked Plains, as they call them, where I'm from. And this story is not about that part of Texas. Far from it. It's about the eastern part of Texas, which is more like Louisiana. It's forested heavily. It rains a lot. There's still a lot of it because it is Texas. But I wanted to show you some photos from Wikimedia Commons. So this is all public domain stuff. This is a public domain show, folks. Strictly public domain. Not strictly. Let's see. Here we go. So this is the current weather map right here. You see we got a little thunderstorm that rolled through here, Wisconsin. And right here you have the great state of Texas. A great state because it is large and because it is interesting. So West Texas is this part right here, the western part. This big chunky thing up here is the Panhandle. And west, this kind of bend is called the Big Bend area, the Trans-Pecos, the Pecos River, as they call it. And it typically looks like this, kind of badlands, desert, maybe some chaparral. I don't know what that means, but I always hear it in terms of like sagebrush, low to the ground, dry, arid. A lot of people think that is Texas, and it is Texas. You're not wrong. But there's so much of Texas that Texas is also this picture with this verdant grass, beautiful, lush wildflowers, red, a little bit of red dirt, but also we got a forest. We got a forest right here. This photo is called Attractive Horse in Van Zandt County, and I'll describe it to those folks who are listening at home. We have a beautiful brown horse with a halter on, tied up to a post, standing in a field full of grass. So much food, so much natural abundance. Could you believe that this picture of Texas, this Badland, mesa-like picture of Texas, is in the same state as this beautiful, attractive horse in Van Zandt County in northeast Texas? Here's another picture of Texas. I bet you didn't think, you might look at this and say, this verdant forest and say, well, that has to be Illinois in June, or Indiana, or even, heck, New Jersey or something. I don't know, wherever. It's not. It's Texas. It's the Big Thicket National Preserve. And Big Thicket is, I don't know whether it's a national forest, but it's a kind of description of southeast Texas, east Texas, because it really is just a wild thicket that you can't hardly walk through. This photo, if you were to turn off this path, you wouldn't be able to move. You'd need a machete, and that's what the first settlers who were kind of going into that area described, is an unfriendly forest full of thorns that was basically impassable. Now, East Texas is generally like Tyler. Sometimes Houston gets considered in East Texas, but it kind of is its own place. But Tyler, Longview, that area is also known as the Ark-La-Tex area, which is Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana. Really beautiful. It's known for roses, just verdant forests. But I lived in a place called Sulphur Springs, really Saltillo, which is a really tiny unincorporated town with a post office. They got a post office. You know, they got their own thing going on there. But Sulphur Springs was a little town of about 10,000, known for dairy production. And I worked on a farm there. And it was beautiful. It was hot. It rained a lot. There were storms that were frightening. Football was big. You turn on the radio, there's high school football games. And then I included this photo. It kind of highlights the savanna woodland, which is kind of, it reminds me of Wisconsin. You know, you have big oak trees, large kind of dominant canopy with a bunch of thicket in between. The other fun fact about Sulphur Springs is that on this square that you see here with this beautiful courthouse, they had glass bathrooms. Now you might be saying, glass public bathrooms on your public square, that's insanity. That's absolutely wild. It is insane, but it's not as insane as you think, because if you're looking at it, you see that they're mirrored. Basically, this bathroom is entirely made out of one-way mirrors. So you go inside, and it looks like you're just sitting in a glass rectangle, and you can do your thing, whatever that may be. You lock it. There's a steel like a steel toilet, a sink, and all the while you can look out and see these people that can't see you. That's crazy. Now that's crazy, but it's true. And I wrote this story. It's a horror story because there was a short story competition at Madison College, where I live, and I was attending at the time. And I wanted to write a spooky story because I like horror stories. It deals with the supernatural, the unexplained, the weird, because at night, those forests, the thicket, gets kind of weird. And the wide open spaces are beautiful in the day, but maybe have a little bit of an intimidating edge. It's a land that is not entirely friendly to humans. And without further ado, without further introduction, I'll read it. It's not perfect. There's sentences I don't like, but hey, that's life. All right. The Boneyard by Robert Greene. Everything in Texas really is bigger. The roads, the cars, the cities, the hats, the boots, everything. Oh, sorry. As usual, I'm going to blow out the candles because I'm not made of money. The crackle of the candle wick to prevent excess smoke. Let's begin again. Everything in Texas really is bigger. The roads, the cars, the cities, the hats, the boots, everything. Texas is also one of the last states that has really held on to a song sense of state pride. I've never met someone from Illinois whose passion for the land of Lincoln could even match the state pride of a Texan in a medically induced coma. With every unconscious breath, the sleeping Texan whispers, "Remember the Alamo." Of course, I'm being hyperbolic here, but I'm from the Midwest myself, and when I first moved down to Texas, it took some getting used to. I moved to Dallas right after college and got a cushy software engineering job at a company that was so big that if I tried to explain exactly what it was the company did, it would sound like I was speaking in a foreign language. I wasn't happy in my job, so I saved up my money to have a little runway, and after a year and a half, I quit. When I turned in my laptop and walked out of the corporate office, I felt like a load had fallen from my shoulders. My plan was simple. I'd tried being a software engineer and I didn't like it, so I thought it would make sense to go as far away from that as possible and become an organic farmer. I wanted to do tangible work, where I could see the results of my labor. Soon after I quit my job, I met some folks that owned a ranch out in northeast Texas who needed some help. When you try to imagine northeast Texas, think forested, thorny Louisiana, not arid El Paso. I'd been browsing online farming forums and saw one of the farmers' posts, and so I responded. In almost every way, it was the perfect opportunity for me. The farm's owners were liberal folks who'd moved from the Dallas-Fort Worth area back to the land their parents had been born on and brought a huge property full of pasture and forests so thick and viney that attempting to force your way through them would render you immobile like a marionette caught up in its own strings. They had 200 head of cattle that they moved around the property as well as a bunch of chickens and a flock of St. Croix sheep. I mostly worked in their 2-acre market garden, where we grew everything from arugula to zucchini and planted, weeded, and harvested it all by hand for a Dallas area market on the weekends. The farm crew was a ragtag bunch of misfits, and Howie was one of the true Texans on the crew. A redneck family man who lived with his wife and kids in a double-wide prefab home 20 minutes away in Saltillo. I don't use the word redneck in a derogatory fashion here. Howie himself would have been the first to admit the fact that he was a redneck, a term he brandished with pride. He grew up in the area in a rundown house on a dirt and sand road and went to high school at the Saltillo ISD, graduated without honors, and did a quick stint in prison for what he described as running with the wrong crowd. I'm still not exactly sure what he did to end up there, but the man didn't have a threatening aura about him. Prison hadn't made him mean and spiteful like it does to some others, but it had left him with nightmares and a couple of face tattoos that took me a while to get over when I first met him. Eventually, I found out that he was a pretty nice guy. Sometimes after work, he would offer you a beer from the driver's seat of his huge, rusty Chevrolet truck. "Want a beer, Andy?" he would say, pointing at me with a lukewarm Lone Star. "No, thanks, man. I don't drink," I'd remind him. "No worries," he said, snapping the can open and taking a slug, driving away on the potholed country road. Say what you want about the whole drinking and driving thing, but the man was generous and always offered to share, even if you didn't drink. The last time Howie and I worked together was on a cloudy late November day. It was Saturday, so the regular crew was off. We arrived at 7 a.m. in front of the farmhouse and stood for a little while in our coats and caps, drinking coffee and talking about the plan for the day. The leaves had begun to brown and fall off the trees in the brisk wind. "So, Andy, should be a pretty easy day today," Howie said. "I think we got to go move the cows and make some new paddocks in the far fields by the pond. And, of course, we got to do all the normal chores." "Yeah, it won't be too bad," I replied. "I think there were some more lambs that dropped last night, so we got to check and make sure they've all bonded with their mothers. I can mix the milk for the rejects over in the tin barn if you want to let the chickens out real quick." The rejects were lambs that hadn't bonded with their mothers. Usually only days old, you'd see them unhappily pining for food and high-pitched bleats while their brothers and sisters nursed happily nearby. If the mother hadn't bonded with the lamb, there wasn't a whole lot that we could do except remove the lamb from the flock and put them in a little shed by one of the barns where we would bottle feed them formula until they were old enough to eat grass. Howie started up the Kubota UTV and headed for the chicken houses while I went around and inside the farmhouse, slipping off my rubber galoshes at the back door. I took the big soup pot used to mix the milk formula and the formula powder from under the sink. 4 scoops of formula went into the pot. I waited for the water coming out of the faucet to run hot before filling the pot and blending the mixture together with an immersion blender. The milk powder made the air smell like milk duds. I carefully laid out 8 pint-sized opaque plastic nursing bottles in the sink and then fit a funnel in the first one. When all the bottles were full, I put on the caps and placed them in the plastic feed bucket so I could carry them all together. I walked out of the house and toward the little barn the lambs were in. The first one saw me and ran up to the chain-link fence next to the door. The other 7 saw him and followed his body language up to me, the benevolent giant whose arrival signaled feeding time. Occasionally, if they were small enough, the reject lambs could slip out through the gap between the chain-link door and the fence itself, so I always made sure to count them when I got down to feed them. I slipped each bottle, nipple pointing down to the ground, into a wooden stand that kept the bottles inverted and stable, and the lambs swarmed their wooden mother. They all fought over the first bottle I had put in the stand and tried to out-nuzzle each other for a chance to drink. The biggest one won out. Then they spread out as they realized one by one that they had more options. Little pink-white tails flicked back and forth with excitement as the lambs gulped down the formula. By the time they had finished pushing each other out of the way and spread out to their own bottles, I saw that one bottle was left unattended and was draining out in a thin stream onto the ground. I looked around for a second and then realized that the missing lamb was Canelo. We'd called him Canelo, which is Spanish for cinnamon, because of his light brown color. There had only been one brown sheep in the group when my farm's owners purchased the flock from a breeder up near Talimena, Oklahoma. The ram was a different breed than the rest of the sheep, and was the only ram that needed to be sheared. The others were a variety with hair that shed with the seasons. Howie was in charge of shearing the ram twice a year to keep him comfortable in the brutal Texas summers. The first time he sheared the ram, I remember Howie coming up to me after he was done, smelling like sweat and mutton. The ram had a brand on its flank underneath all the wool, he told me, wiping sweat from his forehead. What? I said. People brand cows, sure, but who brands sheep? None of the other sheep have any brands, and we all bought them from the same place. They had ear tags. Well, I hear you, but I sheared him, and either he has a real peculiar birthmark in the shape of a half moon and the letter T, or he was branded. The next time I went over to the sheep pasture, I walked over to the brown ram, and while he wouldn't let me get too close without bolting, I crouched down and saw something on his flank. Lighter hair growing in an irregular, well-bounded shape. But I couldn't get very close and wasn't interested in enlisting another person to catch him. Before Canelo was born, we just assumed the ram wasn't able to sire any lambs. Litter after litter came, and none of the lambs had yet resembled him. The ram had disappeared a little bit before Canelo was born. It was likely that he had slipped under the electric fence in search of better grass. We looked for him on all the trails that ran between the pastures and through the woods, but all we found was some brown wool tufts and some brambles. Canelo's mother hadn't rejected him, like the others in the reject pen. She'd fallen ill during the course of her pregnancy, and after she gave birth to the lamb, she became increasingly skinny. Even in her illness, she kept feeding him. We thought Canelo might catch his mother's illness, but to our surprise, the little lamb grew and was healthy. Eventually, his mother couldn't get up or even hold her head above the ground. When we found her cold and rigid, Canelo was still by her side. The veterinarian said it was probably a case of worms that went untreated for too long, so we dewormed the whole flock to make sure it wouldn't spread more. Canelo was different from many of the other timid, skittish sheep in the flock. He was interested in people from the start, and would watch you with his rectangular brown irises whenever he knew you were around. He had a strange kind of focus that I've never seen in any other sheep. Even if I was standing across the pasture, I would see his frame motionless amidst the movement of the flock, like a bronze statue in a bustling public park, staring at me or Howie or whoever happened to be in the paddock. This bothered Howie, who I think took this behavior as some kind of threat. Howie would always jump at him, try to spook him, which only had the effect of scattering the other sheep in the area and leaving Canelo alone. I didn't mind him all that much. Sure, he was odd, but he was one of the few sheep that would let you get close enough to touch him. So whenever I needed a break from hammering stakes into the ground, I'd walk over to Canelo and pet him. He would sniff at my hand and clothes and amble away when he had his fill of human contact. Man, I wouldn't touch that thing, Howie told me once when I was petting Canelo. We were standing in the pasture after making a new paddock in an area of lush, heavy grass that grew underneath 3 ancient pecan trees. It just isn't normal. I never met a sheep that stared at me so long. He seems smarter, At least smart for a sheep, which ain't saying much. It's just creepy. I was kneeling, massaging the top of Canelo's little brown head. Oh, he's just a little weird, is all I said. I put my arms around his torso and gently picked him up, carrying him over to Howie. Sheep always felt hollow to me when I picked them up, like huge fuzzy balloons. Just give him a little scratch in the head, man. You're going to offend him. Howie put both hands out in front of him, palms out. Hell no, man. I don't want whatever he's got to rub off on. And suddenly he trailed off. He angled his head down slightly toward Canelo's midsection, and his eyes widened and jaw went slack. No way, man, he mumbled. What? I asked. Come on, Howie, he's a lamb. You don't have to pet him, but he's not that... Howie cut me off. He's got the same brand as that ram did, he mumbled, brow furrowed. I strained to look over Canelo's side. What are you talking about, Howie? We don't brand any of the animals. Hold him up, Howie said, taking his phone out of his pocket and going down on one knee. He aimed his camera at Canelo's underside and took a photo. Put him down, man, Howie told me. I put Canelo down on the ground and he walked off towards the rest of the flock, sniffing the ground. Howie showed me his phone and zoomed in on the photo he'd taken of Canelo's belly. Sure enough, there was a light patch. So what? He has a little light spot. His mom was that light color, I said. Andy, man, that's exactly what the ram had on his belly, remember? I never saw the spot on the ram close enough to know. Maybe it's a genetic thing. A genetic thing? Look at the damn picture. I looked at it again. The light spot did seem to look kind of like a crescent of a moon, some sort of cross shape. What do you see, man? Do you think I was joking about the ram? He took off his cap and ran his hand through his hair. I don't think you're joking, I said. I just think maybe it's a coincidence, some kind of weird skin thing passed down. Brands don't just pass down from father to son. If my dad was in the Marines, I wouldn't have Semper Fi tattooed on my arm like he did when I popped out. Nothing I said put Howie at ease, and he tried to give Canelo a wide berth from that point on. I thought Howie was just being superstitious, finding a pattern in randomness. He was seeing something in the random shape on Canelo, much like you can see the shape of a bird in a cloud. Now that I think of it, that's not, I mean, you can look at birds in clouds like birds fly, but I mean, like, you can just look up at the sky and, see what, anyway. When Canelo's mom finally died, we were told to go get her withered body and take it to the Boneyard, and to put Canelo in with the other rejects in the tin barn. The Boneyard is a livestock graveyard, tucked back in the woods along a trail that runs between pastures. Whenever something died, we took the corpse over to the Boneyard and left it for the buzzards, coyotes, flies, and bacteria to claim their portion of the farm's bounty. They worked quickly, even on the huge cow bodies that had to be hauled over with a tractor. In only a week, even the biggest bull was hollowed out and stripped down to the bone. There was a sort of dark beauty that existed even in the decay of the Boneyard. Lush grass grew in the negative space of the fleshless rib cages, tracing the outline of whatever animal had decomposed on the ground. On the day that I found that Canelo was absent from breakfast with the flock of rejects, I immediately searched around the perimeter of the barn. He was nowhere to be found, so I decided I would have to search the little patch of woods just behind the barn. The tin barn sat right up against the property line between our farm and the Circle I Ranch that sat to the north of our farm's land. In order to get into the woods, I had to push a barbed wire fence apart and slide through two of the wires, loose and rusty with age. The day was cloudy to begin with, and the leaves and boughs of the woods absorbed the little light that made it through the clouds like dry sponges. I walked forward, looking ahead through the brambles and vines that clung to the gnarled arthritic post oak trees for any sign of movement or the outline of anything vaguely lamb-like. My ears perked up even before I was aware that I'd heard anything. I was moving toward an oak so large that one of the long lower limbs swept down and gently rested on the ground before angling back up towards the canopy. I heard wet, rhythmic sounds punctuated by what sounded like the ripping of fabric on the opposite side of the trunk. My heart rate quickened, and I pulled out my utility knife and flicked it open, sure that I would round the side of the tree and find some sort of stray dog with a scarlet muzzle gorging on the lost lamb. I held the knife ready in my right hand and primed myself to start yelling and startle whatever creature I would find on the other side of the trunk. Inching around the trunk and looking down, I saw Canelo's prone body. He was alive and alone, sitting with his back to me, chewing. A sense of relief radiated out from my chest as I closed the knife and slid it back into my pocket. "Canelo," I said, startling him. He got up quickly on all fours and turned toward me. His face was covered in blood. I walked toward him, trying to see where he was injured, when my eyes focused on something his body had blocked from my view while he was sitting down. It was a corn snake, a small, non-venomous snake with a penchant for climbing into trees and eating birds' eggs out of their nest. The snake was completely shredded and pulled apart. I looked up at Canelo, who was staring back at me. He didn't seem to be injured at all. I stood there, stunned, and Canelo chewed, teeth grinding side to side. I took Canelo back to the tin barn, put him in with the other lambs, and brought out a rag from inside to clean his mouth off. He just stared up at me, protesting very little as I wet the rag and dabbed his lips and face. He must have found the snake, which had to have been killed by a raptor or a hog and partially eaten, and then he just tried putting it into his mouth out of curiosity. Sheep don't hunt. They can't eat meat. I decided not to tell Howie about this. I wasn't sure what this meant, but I knew what Howie would think. He'd probably say something about Canelo being some kind of flesh eater, some kind of reverse chupacabra, and I didn't need the spike in blood pressure that arguing with him about it would give me. I filled the lamb's water and got a little wire to tie between the gate and the fence to try to make sure that nobody would slip out again. Pretty soon, Howie came back from opening the chickens up, and we set out together toward the barn that held the minerals and feed for the birds and pigs. The rest of the morning went smoothly. I was a little quieter than usual, but Howie filled the empty space by talking about his son's most recent baseball game. We turned on my little portable work radio and listened to the classic rock station. Every animal was checked on and fed and given water. When our morning work was done, Howie went home for a few hours, and I went inside to eat lunch and read. I did some laundry and hung the wet clothes out on the line in the backyard. Howie came back a few hours before sundown, and we again made rounds to the animals, bringing food and checking fences. As we worked, the sun dipped low and painted everything orange. The sky turned red, then purple, then dark blue, as the world in front of us was leached of color and then faded to black. Our last task was to take two of the farm dogs, huge white Pyrenees named Brutus and Circe, and put one of them with the sheep and the other with the chickens. Brutus and Circe usually lived inside the farmhouse during the day, napping and sleeping at their owner's feet. They were intelligent, somewhat lazy dogs and were very physically imposing if you didn't know them. Howie went inside to get the dogs, and I stepped out of the UTV, carrying my little radio with me. The radio was one of those emergency combination radios with a little crank and a flashlight on it, so I just carried it around with me at night when I had to do chores in the dark. Having a flashlight while walking around in the dark was a comfort, but having a flashlight and John Mellencamp or Tom Petty blasting from the little radio at the same time made me feel completely invulnerable. Like the sound of rock and roll created a solid force field around me to push away any creepy crawlies or evil spirits. I walked over to the rejects and saw them sleepily sitting down in the dusty hay and dirt floor. The flashlight from the radio shined in their eyes. They tilted their heads down in discomfort. I quickly covered the flashlight and let just enough light seep out from behind my hand so that I had a good view of the pen. They had enough water. I did a quick count of the sheep. 7. Canelo was nowhere to be seen. I heard a snort and the crunch of leaves behind me and swiveled around, dropping the radio and letting out a little yell. "Jeez, man, you scared me jumping like that," Howie said. He was wrangling Brutus and Circe, leaning back like a water skier trying to control them as the two pressed forward against their collars. I bent down and turned off the radio light. "What's wrong, man?" Howie asked. Canelo escaped again," I said. "What do you mean, again?" "He got out earlier while you were opening up the chickens, and I found him back in the woods. I thought I could secure the gate a little bit better, but he got out somehow." "Shit, man. We're going to spend all night looking for that thing. He wants out, let's let him stay out." "Maybe he's back in the woods where I found him earlier," I said. "Let's just look back there, and if he isn't there, we can do the rest of the chores and see if we see him along the way. We can't search the whole farm in the dark, but we have to do our due diligence." Howie paused for a second. I think it might be better if we just let him end up as coyote food. He shifted side to side, and the dogs crunched the leaves around him in the dark. All right, we'll spend a little time back in the woods, and then hopefully find him on our rounds. Brutus and Circe enjoyed our walk through the woods, but we didn't find a lamb. I used the flashlight to sweep through the darkness, to see if any little eyes reflected back any of the light from the beam. We returned to the tin barn after 5 minutes of searching, and drove over to the sheep pasture for the rest of our chores. The electric fence unit for the sheep fencing was a little solar panel attached to a car battery. It charged all day and then zapped all night. It is what it is. I turned it off and ushered Circe in through the gate. In the headlights, I saw her run up to the flock and sniff a few sheep playfully, sticking out her snout into their faces. The flock was used to her by now. The final stop was the chicken coop. We crossed a country road, and bumped along the compacted, potholed dirt path that went by the garden. I turned on the radio and heard advertisements on my usual station, so I shifted the station over to an AM radio station that played oldies, and familiar sounds from long ago drifted out in low fidelity, mixing with the sound of the UTV's engine. Cold air curled behind the windshield and made me zip my coat up to my chin. I stuck my head out from under the roof and looked at the stars. The Milky Way gently glowed like a curtain of lustrous fog crusted with diamonds. Howie braked and brought the UTV to a stop next to the chicken houses. As the sun set, the chickens knew to go up and roost in their houses for the night, making the pasture look deserted as I walked up to the fence and turned off the power. Howie opened the gate and slipped Brutus in. Brutus had been jumping over the fence almost immediately after we put him in and returning back home pretty much every night, but we were told to keep trying to get him to stay in there. I checked the houses. The quiet birds, perched along wooden rails that lined the sides of the houses, stared back at the beam of my flashlight, a stray wing occasionally stretching out and flapping for balance. They were tired and content. I stepped back outside, closing the door, and saw bloody feathers in the dirt. Damn it, I mumbled to myself. A hawk had picked off 2 more birds today. Their bodies were mostly intact, except for huge holes that had been pecked into their abdomens. I resented the fact that the hawks killed the whole bird and ate so little. It was likely that the other chickens had done as much damage to the bodies as the hawk. Chickens robotically pick at anything colored red and aren't above cannibalizing other chickens. I picked the 2 rigid, cold bodies up by the talons with my gloved hand and brought them back to the UTV. Howie was sitting in the driver's seat, face illuminated by some endless scroll app. Hawk got some birds. Looks like we got to head over to the Boneyard, I said. Howie nodded, not turning away from his phone. I gently laid the bodies in the cargo area of the UTV. I didn't like to roughly plop animal bodies down, as other workers would. I don't think that they can still feel pain or anything like that. There's just a part of me that thinks that the difference between a corpse and a living creature is smaller than most people are comfortable admitting. So if I was going to respect living things, it's probably a good practice to respect their recently deceased bodies, too. As I got in the seat, Howie put down his phone and put the UTV in drive. No sign of any lambs out here, he said. He didn't sound too upset. We drove on with the radio quietly babbling. In between songs, an announcer read out the price of corn and cotton. The pasture was bordered by a section of woods, with a thin trail cutting through it, leading to other pastures. We had to take it slow, splashing through a little creek bed and curving along narrow bends in the trail. Branches and vines cracked against the hard plastic of the roof of the UTV. We turned off from the main path onto the side path that led to the boneyard. In the daytime, you could see the location of the boneyard from anywhere on the farm because of the cone of vultures circling above it. At night, the noise of our approach usually scared any creatures away, so the boneyard was only populated by the silent bones that gave it its name. We pulled up to the cut in the wall of vines that served as the entrance to the boneyard, and Howie turned off the engine and the lights. "Wait," Howie whispered. "Turn the radio off." I hit the power button on the radio. The noise cut off mid-sentence. There was something coming up the trail we had just driven. A rustling of leaves, the sound of distant grunting. I heard Howie open up the glove box and pull out the pistol he kept in the UTV for predators or euthanasia of badly injured animals. I heard him cock it, put around into the chamber. "Get your light on." I grabbed the radio, toggled on the beam, and pointed it back toward the trail. The sounds moved closer. It sounded like something was running through the woods, whipping through branches and snapping sticks on the ground. We both waited, me with the light trained out in front of me and Howie pointing his gun. Suddenly, a huge black shape bolted across the path. 3 smaller shapes followed closely behind, squealing, startled by our light. Howie and I both exhaled. "Damn hogs," he said. "I should have popped off a few rounds." We took a second to recover, and then I walked back to the UTV and grabbed the chickens. They dangled at my right side as I walked through the entrance in the vines with the radio in my left hand. The white of the bones reflected in the light as I looked for a good place to put the bodies. Howie entered the boneyard, using his phone as a flashlight, and peered down at a dead sheep he had tossed in the boneyard a few days ago. "Funny how they inflate and puff up," he said, shining his light down on the corpse. "I'm glad it's been cool, or else this place would stink to high heaven." I placed the chickens down gently on the ground and stood up. The light from my radio shone out in front of me, and in the beam stood Canelo, silently looking up at me, eyes reflecting the radio's light. I jumped back. "Howie!" I yelled. "Canelo's over here!" I heard the sound of Howie's footsteps as he ran over to me and stopped at my side. We both stared at the silent little lamb for a second. "Now how in the hell did he get all the way over here?" Howie said. Canelo's mouth opened as if to respond, and black, viscous liquid dripped out. The little lamb's body tensed and he coughed, sending out a spray of dark mist. His jaw dislocated down with a crack, and almost as if pulled from behind by a rope attached to his neck, his upper body pivoted into an upright position, balancing on his hind legs. The lamb's bulging eyes pointed blindly up towards the canopy, and out from his gaping mouth came a jagged cackling, and then a screech like metal scraping across metal as Canelo lurched forward. My hands reflexively flew up to my ears, leaving the radio to tumble to the ground. Howie started shooting blindly, and I ran straight past the UTV and onto the trail, hands pressed on my head, trying in vain to clamp out the sound. Brambles tore at my face and clothes until finally I broke out of the woods and into a pasture. I tripped and fell flat on my chest, hard, gasping for air. The noise that had come from Canelo was gone. The leaves shushed in a gentle gust of wind. No more gunshots rang out. I remember the police treating me gently when they arrived later that evening. A morose woman in a uniform with a braided hair and glasses asked me some questions. I mumbled some answers. I don't remember exactly what I told them, but they went out and found Howie. In the chaos, he had accidentally shot himself through the thigh and hit an artery. His face and fingers had been mutilated by what the coroner determined was a feral pig. They didn't find any living lambs in the boneyard. I think they took my story as a case of mistaken identity in the dark. My tenure at the farm didn't last much longer. I flatly refused to go out into the woods at night, which was treated with some empathy at first, but eventually became a nuisance, and I know when I'm not welcome anymore. I didn't push the matter of Canelo and what I'd seen in the woods. Lambs don't stand upright, and they surely don't eat meat. So that's it. That's the boneyard. That's the whole thing. And it's not a true story, obviously. I definitely took some elements of my life and put them in there. And I think the first part is a little disjoint from the second. You know, maybe there's not so much exposition needed. And I also feel a little bit like the story is kind of like, I did this, then I did this. And then guess what? You wouldn't believe it, but I did this. But, you know, you got to start somewhere. And your first story is your first story. So, yeah, hopefully I will be back next week with another classic horror story. And then maybe as I go along, read some more stories, try to write some more stories and inspiration. I have some guests, some very special guests coming on the show very soon. Yeah, thank you so much for listening. If you ever get a chance, go visit Texas, visit East Texas, even though there's not a lot of tourist attractions. Just check it out. Maybe get some barbecue if that's your thing. Don't if that's not your thing. It's a beautiful, wide open country, and there's nothing else like it. See you next time.